Hello, and welcome back to Humanity First. Today we'll continue following the ongoing saga between Anthropic and the Department of Defense, because there have been some very significant developments on that front. And just to give you a very brief overview of what has happened so far, the DoD has had a campaign to try to sign contracts with all the American AI model providers so that they could rapidly integrate artificial intelligence into their operations. And we know that they signed a contract with Anthropic, and actually Anthropic was the first company to sign a contract with the DoD for $200 million. But they had either or were in the process of negotiating contracts with all the other providers as well. And we've also found out that the military was actually using Anthropic's models. The exact nature of this relationship, from what we understand, is that Anthropic was going as far as hosting custom models for specifically the Department of Defense and the intelligence community as well. So whereas a consumer model that we would be exposed to, that we would have access to, that Anthropic serves for us, for the general public, would refuse, for example, any attempt that you would try to make to have it write you like a malicious script meant for like a cyber attack. These custom models that Anthropic was serving for the government would not have those restrictions. So they would be able to use the models for something like cyber offense. And we found out as well that these models had indeed been used by the military to help with real operations. Like in Venezuela, we know that the models have been used for that. We suspect probably that these models are being used in Ukraine, and I suppose now in Iran as well. So they were actively being used, and they seem to be providing they are of real military significance. Now, the DoD, the terms of the exact contract, they were trying to go beyond that. And they were trying to get the companies that they were dealing with to sign on to an additional document that would essentially give them a carte blanche to use their models however they see fit. They wanted to have no safeguards whatsoever, to have any safeguards be applied on the military's end. And Anthropic was the company that came out very strongly against this. And so there was friction. And the two red lines that Anthropic was holding to was that their models could not be used for mass surveillance, and they could not be used for fully autonomous weapons. But the Defense Department was not having that. They wanted total capitulation, and there was rising friction. And then the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, ordered Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, to Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, and they had a very contentious meeting. And out of that meeting came this ultimatum, a timeline that Anthropic had to agree to the Defense Department's conditions by 5 p.m. on Friday. And yesterday, Anthropic had come out and had said that they could not accept these conditions. And so it did seem like that timeline would expire without any sort of deal or agreement. And when that happened, what surprised me and surprised, I think, Anthropic also to some degree, is the degree of public support that they received. And at least initially, the public support seemed to be across the general public, still till now, despite some actors trying to counteract this, still public support is very strong for Anthropic and for their decision to hold to their red lines. So it seemed like maybe the Department of Defense would concede, or they would walk back some of the threats that they had made. But what we have found out in the last 24 hours is that it's definitely not what was going to happen. That's not what happened at all. And we saw a bunch of things happen. So immediately there were a lot of coordinated attacks on Anthropic. Particularly, there was a very noticeable campaign to try to pin Anthropic as a left-wing organization. So to rouse like partisan feeling. And that took the form of like digging up some of their old constitutions and pointing out certain clauses that these pundits essentially used to paint Anthropic as like a left-wing, out-of-touch, woke institution, and to attack them on that basis. And the president ended up weighing in right before the deadline and essentially saying that effective immediately, all federal employees would not be using, all federal agencies would not be using Anthropic from here on out. And announcing that they would be phasing out all of Anthropic's products within 6 months, their usage in the government. And then Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, came out and followed through on the threat to designate Anthropic as a supply chain risk. And there's still some disagreement or argument about exactly what that would mean. And from what I understand, still till now, they have not taken any official or legal steps yet. But they've only like talked about it. So we'll see how severe they end up going, how significant these actions are. But at least rhetorically, they did follow through on their threat. And then very recently, we had OpenAI sign a contract with the DoD to take effectively Anthropic's spot. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. So Anthropic is out. They have clearly drawn the ire of the government, though it's still somewhat unclear what form that will take. And OpenAI is set to be the, I suppose, replacement for Anthropic. And in a sense, that makes a lot of sense. OpenAI is probably the company that is best placed to replace Anthropic's products. Anthropic is most known for their coding models and for Claude Code, which is like a scaffold and agent that uses their coding models and is especially configured to be a good coding assistant. And of course, OpenAI has Codex, which is supposed to be a direct competing product. So it makes sense to replace Anthropic with OpenAI. And that's essentially the state of affairs. So what can we say the significance of this moment is, of what has happened here? Well, to begin with, what we were saying last time was that actually this particular battle really doesn't matter as much as one would think. It's not that Anthropic was against the usage of their model for military applications completely, because they actually were okay with licensing their models and creating custom models for the military to use. This was only a battle over a very limited number of red lines that Anthropic has. And even in the documents that Anthropic put out to defend their position, what you see that their red lines are extremely minimal. Their argument essentially against having their models be used to power fully autonomous weapons is that the technology is still immature. It's still not good enough to be used in that capacity, which is a very weak and very lame argument, because presumably what it means is that as soon as their models do reach that point, then they would be okay with having the models be used for autonomous weapons. And for mass surveillance, their argument is that still that there isn't robust legislation out yet about artificial intelligence and its usage in mass surveillance. But presumably, if the DoD can convince the Department of Justice that they need a certain usage of AI to conduct mass surveillance for the purposes of national security, then Anthropic would be happy to provide that capability. So what we're arguing about here is something is a very limited set of issues that Anthropic and the Defense Department were going back and forth about. But neither side, no company out there is against, in theory, the military using their models for defense applications. And why is that significant? Well, it's significant because that position guarantees an arms race with China. Models are improving very rapidly, and it's clear that American companies are working with the Department of Defense and that America's military will integrate these models to and apply them towards war ends, towards military ends. And clearly what that will trigger is it will trigger individuals in the Chinese military. It will incentivize them to push AI development, domestic AI development in their country, and to integrate AI into their military as quickly as possible to try to neutralize that advantage that America has. And we have already seen that these models clearly are beginning to be militarily useful. They were militarily useful in Venezuela, and obviously the military considers them useful because it had this whole public feud with Anthropic over their contract. So obviously the military considers these as useful. So really the takeaway is we are at the beginning of an arms race where different countries are going to try to use artificial intelligence to empower their militaries. And of course, this is extremely dangerous. And so we talked about all of that aspect, but I wanted to go past that too, which is at least yesterday when Anthropic had come out against this and there had been some like public support behind Anthropic. At least it was kind of a moral victory. But what we see from the events that have transpired since is that exactly the effect that was predicted, and that is a huge issue of concern, which is that companies, AI companies that value safety, would be penalized as compared to companies that are willing to sacrifice safety for capabilities, to race forward with capabilities as fast as possible. What we see is that the pressures that are being put on these model providers as they continue to scale up their models, as the models continue to improve, are set in such a way as to incentivize dangerous behaviors, to incentivize the development of dangerous models. And what that means is that what that means for those who are worried about this is that whatever policies are devised or whatever strategies we want that are going to be pursued because of the danger of this technology must be specially crafted for the actual world that we live in. Because we live in a world where we are already seeing that the power of these models has attracted the interests of the military. And obviously, the military will want to work with models with limited to no safeguards. And this pressure is only set to increase the further we get into the more useful that AI becomes for military application. And models are already difficult to control. It's already difficult to put safeguards on models. So the idea that these models can be developed with no safeguards, and not only that, but past even so you train them up with no safeguards and then would administer to them like they would be fine-tuned for dangerous activities, for to conduct cyber attacks, to surveil, to take information from many different resources, to perhaps supply targeting information about the location of a certain individual. So this is, of course, extremely dangerous. And clearly, the only way that these kinds of forces can be contended with, the only way you're going to get a counterbalance to these forces is if there is a very large popular movement that is representing those that think that this is dangerous, that can act as a counterbalance to this. Because otherwise, humanity will just sprint straight for disaster. So, yeah, unfortunately, it seems this is another situation where we find ourselves in the worst of all possible worlds. We have now this arms race that will inevitably start. We're only in the early days of AI for military applications. We have the one company that was resisting this. Their red lines were so mild that it wouldn't stop a disaster. And then we saw that even that company that had such minimal restrictions for their contract with the DoD was heavily punished by the government. And their competitor, who was willing to waive away these restrictions, was willing to be more liberal with the policy that they provided, was able to gain. So we'll follow this story as it develops. We'll see what the government actually imposes on Anthropic and if it actually hurts their business. And likewise, we'll see the effects on OpenAI. But yeah, this is not an encouraging picture at all. But finally, I just wanted to say that even though Anthropic's conditions are very minimal and I think insufficient, still, in this instance, they acted with a lot of nobility. And I commend them, because this is not easy to be subjected to such intense attack by the government and still holding to your grounds. That's still very significant. And I'm heartened by the fact that people did rush to support Anthropic, because people feel like this is dangerous. And I hope that one day that same energy, that same momentum, and that same appeal that rallied people behind Anthropic will also rally people against the development of this technology in such a reckless manner in general. And sooner rather than later, before it's too late. So thank you very much for listening. I think that's it, all I have for today, but I'll talk to you guys later. All right, take care.